A luxury watch is never just an object. On certain risks, it becomes a passport. This story follows Breitling into the shadows, where an instrument built for cockpits began signaling power, status, and access inside embassies, private security, and black markets. This isn't a presidential watch showcase or a Rolex versus Patek Philippe debate. It's horology as code. We read the symbolism on the bezel, trace the quiet route from Swiss manufacture to deniable logistics, and examine why the same silhouette kept appearing where timing decides outcomes. Look closely. The clues about crime, influence, and identity are written in lume. Let's start part 1, Origins of a Dangerous Aura, why Breitling became a code. This part explains in plain terms how a respected Swiss brand became a visual code in gray economies. The question is straightforward. Why did Breitling models start to appear on the wrists of people who manage risk, move assets discreetly, and operate between legality and denial? The answer begins with function, then context, and finally the social effects of a very recognizable silhouette. First, the wrist works as an identification surface in high-risk environments. A visible, legible, purpose-built watch communicates 3 things at a glance. The wearer handles tight time windows, the wearer likely has access to aviation or maritime logistics, and the wearer is trained to make decisions under pressure. That nonverbal statement shortens introductions, reduces the need for long explanations, and creates an initial presumption of competence. In that setting, a watch is not decoration, it is a signal. Second, the historical timing favored this signal. After the quartz crisis, the 1990s delivered mature analog digital modules that combine dual time, alarms, countdown timers, strong lume, and accurate temperature-stable quartz movements. At the same time, private military companies expanded, deniable airlifts multiplied, and sanctions created parallel markets. Mobile phones were unreliable, often forbidden, and easily compromised. As a result, timing migrated back to the wrist as a self-contained, silent, and network-independent tool. By the way, every watch hides a story of power, heritage, and intrigue. Subscribe now and uncover how timepieces from Rolex to Breitling have shaped history, culture, and identity. Third, the competitive landscape pushed professionals toward a specific niche. Rolex projected wealth and status so strongly that it attracted attention where attention could endanger the wearer, especially at checkpoints and in corrupt jurisdictions. Omega carried heroic heritage, but many commonly seen references of that era did not offer the fast, programmable, glove-friendly utilities that complex fieldwork prefers. G-Shock and Suunto delivered outstanding practicality, yet in negotiation rooms they often read as budget kit, which can undermine perceived authority. Breitling occupied the middle ground that mattered: instrument-first design, genuine utility, and just enough refinement to look competent rather than ostentatious. From there, branding reinforced what function had already made attractive. Partnerships with aerobatic teams and a design vocabulary drawn from cockpit instruments made Breitling dials read like tools. The phrase "instruments for professionals" did not invent a customer, it organized one. Pilots, special operators, intelligence officers, contractors, smugglers, and fixers recognized themselves in that message and selected themselves into it. Once that clustering began, the look became self-referential. People inside the ecosystem learned to read the watch as a credential. Design decisions made the credential easy to read. Deep anti-reflective coatings preserved legibility under bright lighting, neon, or sun. Large, high-contrast numbers and clear chapter rings reduced decision time when the wearer was fatigued. Knurled bezels and confident crowns allowed operation with wet or gloved hands. Titanium cases and bracelets removed weight and mechanical noise when moving through doorways, vehicles, or tight spaces. Each element served a practical purpose and, in combination, produced a face that looked like work. Clarity then became culture. In operations that depend on strict timing, rendezvous, airfield departures, corridor deconfliction, staged communications, A fraction of a second saved while reading a dial reduces errors. People adjacent to those operations noticed. Gate guards, junior officials, private security, and intermediaries began to interpret the silhouette as competence. Over time, a glance at the wrist performed part of the function of a resume. The meaning was simple and persistent. This person measures minutes for a living. As the culture matured, users developed a simple internal map for the professional line. Without turning this into a catalog, 3 families were treated as distinct tools. Aerospace represented the clean analog digital brain that kept traditional hands while delegating calculations and alerts to discrete displays. B1 stood for an instrument chronograph that added redundancy and a more assertive presence. Chrono Avenger signaled a robust, legible case architecture intended for hard use. This informal mission triad clarified roles in conversation and procurement without requiring technical deep dives, which will be addressed in the next part. Availability along real-world routes amplified adoption. Breitling could be found where these professionals actually traveled. Airport jewelers, duty-free corridors, European and Middle Eastern hubs near embassies, air bases, and contractor hotels. In parallel, customization programs allowed squadrons and special units to add crests or mottos to dials and casebacks. A practical instrument thus acquired a tribal layer. Inside that economy, a unit watch functioned like a wearable challenge coin, a fast, silent way to signal affiliation and clear a low-level trust threshold. The same visibility that smoothed introductions created risk. A distinctive silhouette can be profiled. Journalists, investigators, and counterintelligence officers learned to match watches across photographs and sightings to help connect identities and locations. Hiring managers and fixers looked for the code to accelerate trust. Opponents looked for the code to slow you down or burn a cover. This is the double edge of strong symbolism. It increases efficiency for users and traceability for observers. Despite that cost, adoption persisted because necessity outweighed preference. Professionals continued to choose instruments that worked under stress and projected controlled authority to strangers. As this continued, the brand's reputation darkened not through scandal, but through consistent usefulness in non-permissive environments. Breitling became a toolkit associated with moving people and goods when official routes fail, and with making decisions where outcomes are measured in minutes. The mechanism can be summarized in 4 steps. First, mature analog-digital functionality optimized for legibility and tactile control made these watches effective under stress. Second, case and bracelet architecture balanced visibility with restraint, avoiding the social penalties of obvious luxury while preserving presence. Third, distribution aligned with actual travel patterns of the user base, lowering friction to acquire, service, and replace. Fourth, branding reflected a professional identity that already existed, which encouraged self-selection and reinforced the code. This is why, in the context we are examining, the wrist operates like a document and the dial functions like a confession. 12 markers and luminous paint reveal intent faster than a paragraph of biography. For collectors, that interplay between beauty and purpose explains much of the fascination. For practitioners, it explains why a specific look kept showing up in places where failure is expensive and explanations are dangerous. Part 1 has now established the foundations: the risk as a signal, the 1990s-2000s context that made that signal valuable, the competitive reasons Breitling fit the niche, the branding and design that stabilized the code, the distribution that supported it, and the inherent exposure created by success. Part 2 will move from code to mechanics. It will detail how Aerospace, B1, and Chrono Avenger, along with the emergency, turned seconds into decisions and decisions into outcomes. Part 2. Instruments of Survival. Aerospace, B1, Chrono Avenger, and the emergency. This part explains what these watches actually did in the real world and why that utility mattered. The focus is narrow and practical. how the Aerospace, the B1, the Chrono Avenger, and the Emergency turned seconds into decisions, and how straps, service, and field choreography made them reliable instruments rather than lifestyle props. The goal is not fan language, but operational logic. A watch is never just a watch. Here it is timing, procedure, and contingency. We start with the core requirement shared across covert work, private security, and austere aviation. A wrist instrument must be legible, programmable with one hand, and light enough to disappear until needed. Aerospace established that template. It kept traditional hands for instant reading while adding discrete digital windows for alarms, countdowns, a second time zone, and a fast, no-math date. The underlying quartz architecture minimized drift across heat and cold, and the crown logic allowed quick transitions without cycling through menus. In practice, that meant a user could change time zones at a doorway, set a 5-minute comms window on the way to a meet, and return to an analog face that did not advertise complexity. Weight and noise were not abstractions. Titanium cases and bracelets reduced fatigue over long watches and eliminated the clatter that gives you away on door frames, vehicle sills, and hard furniture. Anti-reflective coatings kept the dial readable under harsh lighting and in glassed-in lobbies where glare wastes seconds. Large, high-contrast numerals and a clean minute track shortened recognition time for tired eyes. Each of these choices shaved tenths off routine tasks. Together, they reduced errors when the margin for error was already thin. The B1 addressed the same problems for users who preferred an instrument chronograph layout with a more assertive presence. 2 digital windows provided redundancy for timing and calendar functions, while the analog hands preserved at-a-glance clarity. The bezel, pushers, and case geometry were sized for operation with wet or gloved hands, and the audible alarm had a practical purpose, a reminder that cuts through engine noise or the low-level hum of a busy room. The result was not a dress chronograph, but a wrist console that tolerated abuse and asked for little explanation. Chrono Avenger carried the logic into a tougher silhouette. The priority remained the same: a legible dial, strong loom, a case shaped to protect the crown and pushers, and water and shock resistance that survived careless moments in hostile places. It wore like armor, but read like a tool. For users who worked around aircraft, boats, or vehicles, that balance was the point. Presence without fragility signals competence to the people you need to convince and indifference to the people you do not. All 3 of these models supported the same field choreography, and the choreography is what matters. Dual time covered aliases and cross-border scheduling without calculations in the doorway. Countdown synchronized a staggered team whose members were not supposed to speak until the last moment. Alarms guarded narrow comms windows when radios came alive only long enough to confirm or abort. Chronographs timed vehicle swaps, fuel transfers, and short-run flights. None of this is glamorous. It is a list of repeatable tasks that break missions into minutes. Straps were not fashion. They were interface. NATO and Velcro could be worn over flight suits and plate carriers, removed quietly, and refastened without tools. Rubber tolerated fuel, oil, and salt water on piers and decks. Leather blended into civilian environments where a visible tactical strap invites the wrong questions. In each case, the strap matched the cover and the job, and wear marks became a record of hours, not an aesthetic choice. Patina signaled experience to insiders and passed unnoticed by everyone else. Serviceability mattered as much as features. Quartz modules with long battery intervals and straightforward servicing could be maintained in cities where contractors staged and diplomats rotated. Authorized points near airports and embassies turned routine maintenance into a short errand instead of a multi-week interruption. In practice, this kept instruments in circulation and reduced the temptation to switch to whatever was available locally when a mission was already in motion. A tool that leaves the wrist for a month fails its purpose. A tool that can be returned to service in a day does not. The emergency sits apart because it added a last resort function. Concealed in the case was a micro-transmitter with a deployable antenna designed to broadcast a distress signal on internationally monitored frequencies. Used correctly and in the right conditions, it could help direct search and rescue assets toward a pilot, sailor, or remote contractor whose other options had failed. That capability created a powerful narrative, a watch that might call help across terrain and water. It also created obligations. Owners were typically required to acknowledge the risks of false activations and the maintenance regime that keeps the transmitter in spec. False alerts generate paperwork and cost. Careless use creates precisely the kind of attention many users try to avoid. This double edge did not reduce the appeal for those who worked far from infrastructure, but it did force serious users to treat the emergency as equipment, not magic. When all of these elements are placed back into their environments, the logic becomes plain. Time on target is not a motto. It is a number on a bezel that aligns multiple actors who will not talk until the last minute. Air corridor deconfliction without a shared network relies on synchronized watches and pre-agreed marks, not improvisation. Maritime rendezvous on dull, rainy nights run on countdowns that keep boats moving rather than loitering. Handovers between pilots, drivers, or escorts often happen against a timed cue because clocks are neutral when radios are not. These examples illustrate why tools over gloss is not a slogan but a purchasing policy. Distribution reinforced this practicality. The references discussed here were commonly available along the routes used by the people who needed them. Airport retailers, duty-free counters, and shops near embassies and airbases in Europe and the Middle East. That proximity reduced friction for acquisition and service, and it also normalized the presence of these watches in those communities. A tool is adopted faster when it is on the shelf where you already passed through. It is important to note what these instruments did not try to be. They were not designed to attract attention across a room. They were designed to attract attention from the wearer's eye in a fraction of a second. They were not trying to be smarter than the phone. They were trying to be independent of it. They did not advertise the most expensive materials. They used materials that solve problems, like titanium for weight and anti-reflective crystals for visibility. Those choices explain why the same references show up in photographs taken in hotel lobbies, on tarmac edges, and in cramped cabins. The context is their marketing. The cumulative effect is why reputations form. Users who rely on programmable alarms, quick time zone flips, and legible dials under fatigue will cluster around the designs that make those tasks easy. Observers who see the same silhouettes in the same kinds of places will form associations. Over time, the association becomes a code. This is what you wear if you time things for a living. That code carries benefits: faster trust, smoother logistics, and risks: pattern recognition by people who are paid to notice. Both sides of the equation exist because the instruments worked. This concludes the functional core of the story. Aerospace provided the clean analog digital brain, B1 offered redundant instrument-forward timing and a stronger voice, Chrono Avenger packaged legibility and a protective shell, and the Emergency added a last-ditch rescue layer with real capabilities and real obligations. Together, they explain why, in the years after the quartz crisis and during the rise of private security and deniable logistics, Breitling became a practical choice. In Part 3, we will follow the adoption beyond professional operators into the domains of unit culture, private mercenaries, oligarch circles, and cinema. And we will examine how a tool that signals competence can be repurposed as currency, invitation, and signature. Part 3. Underworld Adopters. Unit Watches, Mercenaries, Oligarchs, and Cinema. This part explains how a professional tool migrated from official users to unofficial ones. The path runs through unit culture, procurement shortcuts, gray market circulation, and media amplification. The result is a watch that became a credential, a currency, and a signature at the same time. The logic is sequential. First the unit ecosystem, then the private security spillover, then criminal and oligarch adoption, and finally the cultural echo created by film and television. We begin with unit watches because they formalize the code. Military squadrons and special units commission small batches customized with crests, mottos, or mission marks. These were not fashion extras. They were practical instruments that doubled as internal identifiers. In closed communities, a recognizable dial or caseback compresses a background check into a glance. If you know the crest and the year, you know the story. That is why insiders compare these pieces to challenge coins worn on the wrist. Procurement processes were simple enough to reproduce. A unit representative gathered artwork in quantities, a brand liaison validated the design, and a minimum order turned an internal symbol into a shipped product. Records existed, but not always in a way that stands up to later audits. Transfers, gifts on departure, and handovers across allied teams created gaps. Those gaps explain why watches intended to stay inside a squadron later surfaced in markets far from the base. Leakage was not a scandal. It was a predictable byproduct of human movement. Once leakage began, a secondary economy formed. Collectors valued the story and the scarcity. Operators valued the recognition and the favors these pieces could still call in. Fixers valued the way a unit watch could open a conversation without a dossier. Each group had different reasons, but all understood the speed advantage. A watch that instantly establishes affiliation is faster than a phone call, and in transactional environments, speed is leverage. A watch is never just a watch when it lowers the cost of trust. By the way, behind every dial lies more than mechanics. There are secrets of influence, survival, and symbolism. Subscribe and step into the world where a watch is never just a watch. The same logic explains the private security spillover. Contractors and PMCs mirrored the habits of the military units they worked alongside, ordering batches for teams or buying similar references off the shelf. The effect was to blur the line between official and deniable actors. If a crest marks a government unit and a near-identical silhouette marks a private team, the visual code still works. The person across the table sees competence and timing. That is enough to smooth a negotiation or calm a checkpoint. From here, the move into criminal and war economy use becomes understandable. People who operate outside the law but inside complex logistics have the same need to signal competence and access. They also have a need to carry value discreetly. Mid-tier luxury watches meet both requirements. They are valuable enough to function as collateral, yet common enough to avoid the suspicion that follows high jewelry pieces. They can be pawned, traded, or gifted without paperwork. In countries where currency controls or sanctions complicate cash, a recognizable watch is a portable reserve. Authority projection played a part as well. In corrupt jurisdictions and disputed territories, a visible instrument watch that reads as pilot or operative can influence behavior. Guards and minor officials often respond to cues associated with aviation, military work, or foreign contracting. A large, legible instrument-forward Breitling taps that association. It does not prove rank, but it suggests access, extraction, or consequences. That suggestion is sometimes enough to tilt a bribe calculation, ease a route, or shorten a delay. Oligarch adoption followed a different but related path. Here, the point was not pawnability, it was admission. Commissioning small runs with yacht names, flight wings, or corporate marks turned watches into invitations. Being handed one meant you had stepped inside the perimeter. Wearing one signaled that you belonged in rooms where deals are oral, deniability is valuable, and reputations move faster than contracts. In those circles, power on the wrist means the power to enter, not just to time. Smugglers and fixers use the same objects as fluid collateral. At a border town where money moves slowly and paper trails are dangerous, a watch becomes a flexible instrument. It can be exchanged for fuel, for a vehicle part, for a phone that works, or as a good faith deposit for services. The receiver does not need to verify a serial number on the spot. The silhouette and condition tell enough of the story. Tools over gloss is not a slogan here. It is the filter that decides what still converts to value when the network is weak. Cinema amplified these signals, but did not create them. Prop departments select objects that compress character into a frame. For mercenaries, smugglers, or rogue pilots, a Breitling with a clear, instrument-like face communicates more in one shot than a line of dialogue. When audiences repeatedly see that pairing, they internalize the code. Some viewers later enter the same professions. Others enter adjacent ones. Either way, the screen turns a professional habit into a cultural expectation, and the loop tightens. Real operators wear the watch because it works, actors wear it to read as operators, recruits wear it because both references align. As the loop tightened, signature risk increased. Distinct silhouettes become searchable. Investigators and counterintelligence officers began to link appearances across images using the watch as one of several markers. A repeated outline on a NATO strap or a particular crown guard profile is not proof, but it narrows a search. That is the cost of a strong visual code. The same marker that speeds trust also speeds targeting by people paid to notice patterns. Operational countermeasures emerged quickly. Teams rotated watches the way they rotate vehicles and routes. Some moved to sterile field pieces, micro brands with generic faces, or battered beaters that break the pattern. Others kept their instruments but changed how they wore them. Cuffs down, hands low, dials turned inward until the moment of use. These are small adjustments, but they reflect a larger reality. In the era of open-source investigation, anything distinct becomes data. Checkpoint psychology demonstrates both sides of the equation. A guard at a remote post who understands little about the mission may still recognize an instrument watch and wave a traveler through with less friction. The same guard superior, trained to look for repeating cues, may take the watch as a tell and escalate scrutiny. Neither reaction is irrational. Both are rational responses to a world where symbols carry information. The dilemma for users is that they cannot control which reaction they will encounter on a given day. Character-level vignettes illustrate how the watch functions beyond timekeeping. A private military founder gives emergency models to key staff with a promise of rescue, creating loyalty and a corporate myth that binds a team. An oligarch orders a 50-piece run for a yacht crew and close associates, turning a tool into a quiet badge of inner circle status. A smuggler trades a battered Aerospace for diesel at a frontier station when cash is frozen, converting reputation into movement. An operative abandons a recognizable B1 after appearing in open-source footage, switching to a sterile field watch to break the link. Each case shows the same principle. The watch carries information, and information moves events. The media echo is important for another reason. Once films, series, and documentaries establish Breitling as the dangerous professional's watch, the association jumps audiences. Collectors outside the field begin to want the aura of competence, even if they will never need the functions. This demand feeds the secondary market for unit pieces and hard-use references. It also ensures the code will be seen in more places, which increases both its social power and its exposure. Reputation and risk rise together. Seen from a distance, none of this is mysterious. A practical instrument used by professionals acquired a second life as a credential in adjacent worlds, then a third life as a cultural icon. Along the way, it became a unit token, a bribe substitute, an invitation, a bluff, and a breadcrumb. The consequences are mixed. Users gained speed and leverage, observers gained a handle for pattern recognition. The myth grew because the tool worked, the danger grew because the myth worked. This brings the narrative to the present tension. The same adoption that made Breitling a shorthand for competence also tied it to private war, sanctions workarounds, and criminal logistics. The brand's darkness is not gossip. It is the shadow cast by utility in hard places. In Part 4, we will address the ethical frame, The brand's turn toward mainstream appeal, the modern threat model that penalizes connected devices and rewards silent instruments, and what a credible mission-first revival would require in the next Aerospace. Part 4. After the Edge. Ethics, Cleanup, Smartwatches, and the Next Aerospace. This part addresses 4 questions that close the documentary. First, what are the ethical implications of a luxury brand whose tools became useful in environments of coercion and deniable logistics? Second, how did the brand's mainstream repositioning in recent years change the association with those environments? Third, what does the modern threat model say about connected devices versus silent instruments? Fourth, what a credible, mission-first revival would require if power on the wrist is to remain a practical statement rather than a nostalgic slogan. The ethical frame is straightforward. A manufacturer does not choose every customer, but marketing archetypes do attract specific tribes. When a brand emphasizes jet teams, cockpit dials, and instruments for professionals, it inevitably appeals to people who time real operations, not just flights of imagination. That appeal has consequences. In legitimate settings, the consequence is competence. In gray settings, the same appeal can support activities that harm. The responsible stance is neither denial nor glamorization. It is clarity. A watch is never just a watch. It is an object that can save time, save lives, or amplify the capacity to control others. A documentary treatment must keep all 3 possibilities in view. With the ethics stated, the brand pivot needs context. Over the last decade, Breitling tightened collections, revived vintage lines, and broadened its audience beyond the professional niche. Case sizes became more restrained, finishes more refined, and lifestyle storytelling more prominent. This mainstreaming had 2 effects relevant to our narrative. It diluted the public link between the logo and deniable work, and it reduced the visible priority of unit customization programs that once turned instruments into tribal identifiers. Neither outcome erases the past association. Both move it from the front of the stage to the wings. Collectors who want the old professional ethos still find it in earlier references. New buyers encounter a brand that leads with heritage, sustainability, and fashion collaborations rather than flightline pragmatism. Tools over gloss still appears, but it is no longer the single headline. The modern threat model also changed the calculus. Many sensitive facilities restrict or ban connected devices because they create data exhaust. Bluetooth traffic, Wi-Fi beacons, GPS logs, microphones, motion sensors, and cloud backups. In those environments, a smartwatch is a liability. A silent, non-networked instrument remains acceptable because it performs timing without transmitting or recording. That alone explains why analog-digital tools still matter. At the same time, signature risk did not disappear. Distinct silhouettes are easier to profile than ever because open-source imagery, social posts, and face-level cameras multiply angles. Users adapted by choosing smaller, matte references, rotating pieces, or moving to sterile dials that do not resolve into a recognizable brand at low resolution. The lesson is simple. Silence wins over telemetry, and discretion wins over iconography. Game theory helps to describe the present equilibrium. In earlier phases, wearing a mission-coded watch was a positive signal with limited downside. It sped trust and rarely created traceable patterns. Today, the payoff matrix has changed. The same signal still speeds trust with some audiences, but it carries a higher probability of being logged, cropped, and matched by adversaries. Rational actors adjust by signaling competence through behavior and results rather than through recognizable kit. The visible watch becomes a weaker proxy for credibility, and the costly signal shifts towards tools that are less distinctive or towards procedures that cannot be screenshotted. Power on the wrist is still power, but it is increasingly expressed through what does not stand out. Sanctions and fractured economies add another dimension. During commodity shocks, capital controls, or currency instability, portable mid-luxury remains a discreet reserve. A mid-5-figure diamond bangle triggers attention. A 4-figure instrument watch often does not. That asymmetry keeps watches in the toolkit of shadow commerce. The compliance counterforce is also real. Export controls, know your customer regimes, and custom scrutiny around specific corridors tightened. The outcome is not the disappearance of the watch as collateral. It is a higher level of friction and a narrower set of routes. Documenting this tension is essential to avoid romanticizing it. The same object that serves as emergency liquidity for a pilot stranded far from home can also enable a transaction that keeps an abusive network running. Both are true. The difference lies in who wears it and why. All of this sets the specification bar for any mission-first revival. If Breitling or any brand intends to deliver an instrument that earns trust in 2025 and beyond, the requirements are clear. Size must be restrained to reduce signature and improve wear under cuffs. Materials should favor titanium or bead-blasted steel with minimal polish to avoid reflections and photographic recognition. Crystals need deep, double-sided anti-reflective coatings that prioritize legibility under neon, sun, and glass. Lume should emphasize fast charge and long persistence without showy color shifts. Crowns and pushers must be glove-friendly and operate by tactile logic that a user can memorize. Dials should be high contrast with minute tracks that enable error-free reading at a glance. The movement should be thermocompensated quartz or equivalently stable, with simple, reliable time zone jumps, alarms, and countdowns. Nothing should require an app. Nothing should leave a digital trail. Straps and ergonomics are part of the specification, not accessories. A quick-change system that locks under load allows a switch from NATO to leather to rubber without tools and without risk of accidental release. Hardware should be subdued, preferably muted steel or titanium with secure keepers that do not catch. The watch must tolerate fuel, oil, salt, and shocks associated with vehicles, decks, and hangars. Service must be local to major travel nodes. A mission watch that cannot be serviced where missions are staged is a display piece. For any continuation of rescue-adjacent functions, the emergencies lessons apply. A beacon cannot be a fantasy. It must comply with current rescue frameworks, require proof of maintenance, and make the consequences of misuse explicit. Training material should be as rigorous as the marketing is persuasive. If regulations make an integrated distress transmitter impractical, an honest alternative is a modular accessory that pairs mechanically, not digitally, and that can be registered and maintained on its own schedule. In every case, the priority is to replace myth with procedure. Governance around unit or institutional customization would also need an update. If a brand resumes CREST programs, it should implement verifiable authorization, serialization that protects the unit from counterfeit, and purchase paths that do not leak sensitive details into retail databases. Some communities will choose to avoid unit markings entirely to reduce signature. The point is not to revive the old challenge coin on the wrist without changes. It is to support professional identity without creating unnecessary exposure. None of these requirements conflict with luxury. Luxury in this segment means reliability, decisive legibility, and the calm that comes from a tool that works every single time. The collector audience understands this better than most. A coherent professional watch can sit under a cuff at a dinner and still be the most competent object in the room. Tools over gloss does not reject beauty. It insists that beauty follows function. If a new Aerospace or its sibling can embody that rule, the historical association with serious work will make sense again, without leaning on nostalgia or on the Underworld shadow. The paradox remains. The more the industry polishes its image for a broad audience, the more a subset of users looks for objects that express restraint, reliability, and silence. Those objects may carry a darker aura because they are built to perform in darker places. But that aura is not the point. The point is performance. If the next generation of instruments is defined by controlled visibility, rigorous function, and zero telemetry, the code will survive on its merits rather than on its myth. A watch is never just a watch. In the right hands, it is a plan measured in minutes.